Hello, everybody. I thought it might be helpful before we continue our study in Matthew 15 to take a look at some of the places that are mentioned in the Bible. And so just so we can get sort of an orientation where they are in relation to each other and get an idea of what kind of distances are involved. So let's start with a space station view of the Middle East. So just starting with the major water feature, the oceans and the waterways. Up here in the upper left, of course, is the Mediterranean Sea, and then over on the far right here is the upper reaches of the Arabian Gulf, and then down here on the bottom is the top or the north of the Red Sea. And at its northern end, the Red Sea has two arms: the Gulf of Suez on the west and the Gulf of Aqaba on the right. Now, right here, the Suez Canal connects the city of Suez with the city of Port Said on the north. This is called in the Bible the Brook of Egypt. Now, in between these two arms of the Red Sea is the Sinai Peninsula, and you'll probably remember that the Sinai Peninsula is where the Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years after leaving Egypt. That's documented in the books of Numbers and Exodus. Now, somewhere on the Sinai Peninsula, and no one really knows where, is Mount Sinai, where Moses received the Ten Commandments. Now, this Suez Canal, which is called in the Bible the Port of Egypt, shouldn't be confused with the River of Egypt. The River of Egypt, of course, is the Nile, and it starts from its headwaters that aren't shown on this map in the south, and it flows up through Egypt and into this delta before it empties into the Mediterranean Sea. Just off the map to the left here is the city of Alexandria. There was a big library there, a very famous library where that was a center of scholarship in the time of the Egyptians. So on this map, the red lines are the international boundaries. So we have Egypt here on the west and Saudi Arabia on the south. And then on the east here, we see the western part of Iran. And just to the west of Iran and north of Saudi Arabia and north of Kuwait is Iraq. And then in between Iraq and the Mediterranean Sea is Syria. And then in between Syria and Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Israel is the nation of Jordan, formerly called Transjordan. And then, of course, on the Mediterranean coast is the state of Israel, and to its north, the country of Lebanon. Now, this area between the Mediterranean Sea and the middle of the desert here is known as the Levant, and it actually stretches a little bit north of here. The Jordan River flows through the middle of the Levant. It's marked by this green line here, and then it flows through the Sea of Galilee, and it forms the border between, through the Sea of Galilee, flows down to the Dead Sea, and that's where it ends. In between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, the Jordan River forms the border between Jordan on the east and Israel on the west. Now, what you can't tell here from this map, or from any map really, is the elevation. But the Jordan River is the northernmost part of the Great Rift Valley. You may have read recently that scientists are saying that the eastern side of Africa is going to break off from the rest of the continent eventually. Well, don't worry too much, because that's going to happen at a pace of a few tens of millimeters a year, I think. So it's not going to happen for a very, very long time, not until after we're long gone anyway. So anyway, this Great Rift Valley is the lowest spot on Earth. Right here in the middle of it is the Dead Sea, the lowest spot on Earth, about 1,300 feet below sea level. Now, that's, of course, the lowest spot, not including the bottom of the oceans. Anyway, the Great Rift Valley continues down through the Gulf of Aqaba and through the Red Sea and off of this map down to Ethiopia in the Horn of Africa, and then it goes across the eastern side of, or down the eastern side of Africa all the way to Mozambique. Now on the other side of the map, these other two green lines here, this one on the north is the Tigris River, and then on the south is the Euphrates River. Now both of these start in the mountains of Ararat in Turkey, which is famous, of course, for where the Ark of Noah landed after the flood. In between the two rivers, well, let's continue talking about the rivers first. They start in the southern Turkey, and they flow down through Iraq, or what's today Iraq, to this spot that's marked by this map pin here. They come together just north of the modern city of Basra at what's a place that's known in the Bible as Ur of the Chaldeans. And of course, Ur of the Chaldeans was the home of Abraham. Abraham was called by God to go from Ur of the Chaldeans up to Padan Aram up here in the north, close to the Euphrates River, and then he stayed there for a while, and then God told him to continue on down to the land of promise here, Canaan, which is now the state of Israel. You may remember that Padan Aram is where Isaac was sent to go and find a wife, and he found Rebekah. And then later on, Isaac's son, Jacob, was sent back to Padan Aram to find a wife, and he actually came back with four. Leah, Rachel, Zilpah, and Orpah, I think was the other maiden's name or maid's name. So in between the Euphrates River on the south and the Tigris River on the north, this shaded area here that's labeled the Plain of Shinar is also known as the land between the rivers, Mesopotamia. It's also known as the Fertile Crescent, and you can see that it's greener than the rest of the area. It's very well watered. There's a myriad of canals that go back and forth, but even that greenery is not very green. It's pretty darn dismal. In the Bible, the Plain of Shinar is famous as the place where Nimrod and his followers built the Tower of Babel, somewhere on the Plain of Shinar. Don't really know where. You can read about that in Genesis 10 and Genesis 11. The ancient city of Babylon was built on the Euphrates River just south of the modern city of Karbala. And Saddam Hussein has, or before his unfortunate demise, he had rebuilt Babylon as a sort of a tourist attraction, but it hasn't really caught on. Not many tourists go to Iran. The political situation is just pretty dismal there. So the two rivers flow together at Ur of the Chaldeans, and they form this waterway here called the Shat al-Arab, and the two joined rivers flow into the Arabian Gulf just north of the state of Kuwait. This is Kuwait right here. The Shat al-Arab was the site of the worst of the fighting in the Iran-Iraq War, which saw the most casualties since World War II, over 1 million casualties. in the overall Iran-Iraq War, but a great many of them were down here in this area, the Shat al-Arab. And as you can see, in modern times, the rivers have been dammed. You can see this big lake here, and there are a couple of other big lakes. Let's see, what else is there to say here? Just as an aside, in Genesis 15, verses 18 to 21, God promised Abraham all of the land between the river of Egypt, that is the Nile, not to be confused with the brook of Egypt. So from there all the way to the Euphrates River. And as you can see, that takes up the better part of Egypt, eastern half of Egypt, almost all of Iraq and Syria, and all of Jordan, a fair part of northern Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and all, of course, of the current state of Israel and the state of Lebanon, or the nation of Lebanon. The Israelites have yet to possess all of that land. Even Solomon, when he was in his heyday, only ruled over a small portion of that land. So the fulfillment of this prophecy, God giving all of this area to Abraham, has yet to be in the future. So dropping down now a little bit lower, and just looking at the modern nation of Israel, say we drop down to, say, Chinese spy balloon altitude, or maybe SR-71 cruising altitude. We have the modern state of Israel. Here on the left, or the west, is the eastern part of the Sinai Peninsula that we just looked at. Here is the nation of Jordan, and then up here is Syria. And then we can just see Iraq jutting into Jordan here a little bit. So the current boundaries of the nation of Israel are the solid line, and it stretches from up here at Mount Hermon all the way down to the Gulf of Aqaba, to a resort city called Eilat. And then from there, the line goes pretty much straight up to Gaza, along the Mediterranean Sea, up to a spot in between Haifa and Tyre, about halfway, and then it goes across, meanders its way back up to Mount Hermon. Now, these red dotted lines are the boundaries of the areas that are currently under the control of the Palestinian Authority. This area here that's marked as Samaria and Judea is known as the West Bank, and then this area down here is known as the Gaza Strip. Now, in 1947, when the United Nations made a resolution that was going to partition Palestine, prior to 1947, ever since the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I in 1920, that formed the formal peace treaty for World War I in 1920, Palestine had been allocated as a mandate of Great Britain. And then Lebanon, this is the current nation of Lebanon here, Lebanon was allocated to France as a mandate of France, and they were to manage and control those areas. Well, then in 1947, the United Nations passed a resolution that partitioned Palestine into a Jewish-controlled area and an Arab-controlled area. The Arab-controlled areas, there were two of them, The West Bank was occupied and governed by Jordan, which back then was called Transjordan. And then this area, the Gaza Strip, was managed by the Arab League. And that was the way it was. Oh, and by the way, Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, which is right here, was divided. West Jerusalem, in the what the Jews called the War of Independence that took place between 1947 and 1949. In the armistice, Jordan was given control of East Jerusalem, and the Jews took control of West Jerusalem, and the city was partitioned. The Jews, during the War of Independence, took the Temple Mount and the eastern portion of Jerusalem, but they weren't able to hold it. And so in the armistice, the east part of Jerusalem went to Jordan, and the west part of Jerusalem went to the new state of Israel. And then Jordan occupied Samaria and Judea, and that was the way it was until 1967, the Six-Day War in 1967. The Jews retook all of the West Bank, they retook the Gaza Strip, and they retook all of the city of Jerusalem. They also took this area up here, this gray area, known as the Golan Heights. In the Bible, that's known as Bashan. And then over the intervening years, by the way, in the 1973 war, the Yom Kippur War, the Israelis held on to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and the Golan Heights. And then over the course of a few decades since the 1973 war, they had this land for peace idea that they would turn over control of Judea and Samaria back to the Palestinian Authority and also the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip, by the way, from 1949 to 1967 was controlled by the Arab League. Egypt did not say it was part of Egypt, and neither did any other nation, but they did say that it wasn't part of Israel, and so it was controlled by the Arab League. And then, as I said, in 1967, the Israelis took the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. But in the meantime, they've given back control of the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, and the Gaza Strip back to the Palestinian Authority. But they have not given back control of the Golan Heights, and there's a good reason for that. The Golan Heights sit several thousand feet, well, not several thousand, a couple thousand feet above the Sea of Galilee, which is right here. The Sea of Galilee is Israel's only source of fresh water. And so anyone with evil intent could just lob a dirty bomb into the Sea of Galilee from the Golan Heights in an artillery shell and just destroy Israel's fresh water supply. And so I believe Israel will never, ever give back the Golan Heights. So before we move on here, Israel plays a very large part in the international political stage, but it's a small country, a very small country. It's only 200 miles from up here at Mount Hermon that forms the border between Syria, Israel, and Lebanon, down to Eilat on the Gulf of Aqaba. It's only 200 miles. At its widest spot, between Gaza and the Dead Sea, Israel's only 70 miles wide. And, Jerusalem, the capital city of Israel, is only 150 miles from the capital city of Syria, Damascus. It's only 45 miles from the capital city of Jordan, Amman. And then at its narrowest spot, right here between the Mediterranean coast and the border of Samaria, Israel is only 7 miles wide. Now, just before we go on, these two cities, Tyre and Sidon, on the Mediterranean coast in what's now Lebanon, were once the main seaports, the most powerful and prosperous seaports of the Phoenicians, who were a great seafaring nation. They were subsequently defeated by the Persians, and then after that by Alexander, and then finally the Romans. So by Jesus' time, they no longer really had a lot of power, but they were still important seaports. Let's just put it that way. And then just before we leave, this area right here that's made by this, or delineated by this dotted line, is a demilitarized zone between Syria on the east and Israel on the west. It's been that way since 1973, since the Yom Kippur War. And I think that's about all we have to say about this map. So let's go to the next one. So if we drop down here to about, say, airliner level, we get a look at the northern part of Israel, the province of Galilee. And so Galilee stretches from the Mediterranean coast over to the Jordan River. And these days, of course, it includes the Golan Heights, which are right up here. You can see there's quite an elevation change to get up from the Sea of Galilee. Haifa is Israel's main harbor, and then it stretches from there over to the Sea of Galilee, which of course is the main feature of Galilee. On the south, it stretches from the city of Caesarea Maritima, which is where Paul departed in chains for Rome. And then it stretches to the Jordan River. This city right here, Bet Shan, was where the Philistines took the body of King Saul and his sons, or bodies, and nailed them to the wall of the city. And then some brave Israelite men came and took the bodies down from the wall and buried them in the land of Saul's ancestors. In the middle of Israel, or in the middle of Galilee, is this valley of Jezreel, this shaded area here. It stretches from Mount Carmel on the west, which is where Elijah defeated the prophets of Baal, and it stretches on the east to Mount Tabor, which is one of the possible sites of the Mount of Transfiguration. Mount Tabor, you may recall, was where Deborah and Barak defeated the Canaanite army that was commanded by Sisera. And of course, we have that lovely story in Judges 4, I think it is, or Judges 5, where Sisera was running from the Israelites, and I forget what the girl's name was, but she hid him in her tent, and then she fed him some goat's milk, and he was sleepy, and while he was sleeping, she took a tent peg and pounded it through his temple. A very lovely, uplifting story here. Now, above the Valley of Jezreel, and I forgot to mention, the Valley of Jezreel has seen more combat than any other site on earth. The Egyptian pharaohs fought here, the Babylonians fought here, the Persians fought here, Alexander the Great fought here, and the Romans, of course, when they conquered the land, fought here. The Crusaders, the European Crusaders, fought here and were defeated by the Turks And believe it or not, even Genghis Khan and even Napoleon fought in this area. Now, just above the valley of Jezreel is this city of Megiddo. Now, if you look this up in the Bible, you'll find it spelled with 2 D's. That is where Solomon built his chariot city. And the hill that Megiddo is built on is known by the 2 Hebrew words meaning mountain, or har, and place of crowds, Megiddon. So in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, Revelation 16:16, those 2 Hebrew words, har and Megiddon, are combined and transliterated into Greek as Armageddon. So apparently the Valley of Jezreel hasn't yet seen the last of mortal combat. Now, just north of the Valley of Jezreel, see this steep cliff here. Nazareth, the home of Jesus' mother and father, stepmother and mother and stepfather, Joseph and Mary, were from Nazareth. And you may remember the story when Jesus read the scroll of Isaiah in the synagogue at Nazareth, and he said it was a messianic prophecy that he read, and he said that today this scripture is fulfilled in your presence. Well, they took that to mean I am God, which of course it did mean. And so they tried to throw him over this cliff, but he passed between them. It's quite an impressive cliff. Anyway, south of the Valley of Jezreel is this city that the modern name is Nin. In the Bible, it's called Nain or Nain, and that is where Jesus raised the widow, the son of a widow, out of death, if you may recall. You can find that in Luke 7. Up above the city of, or the Valley of Jezreel, north of Nazareth, nobody knows exactly where, is Cana. And Cana is where Jesus performed the very first miracle of his ministry, turning the water into the wine at the wedding feast. No one really knows where Cana is or was. It may be near this modern city of Kafar Cana, but nobody really knows. It hasn't been excavated yet. So let's see here. Now, just as an interesting side note here, down here at the bottom or the southern end of Galilee, on the Mediterranean coast, is Caesarea Maritima. It was built by Herod the Great. It's an amazing city. As I said, it's where Paul departed in chains for Rome. And it was a terminal for passengers and freight as well, a seaport in Israel at the time of Jesus and afterward. In Caesarea Maritima was found a stone. It was, they say, the archaeologists say it was in secondary use. Basically what they did, they'd taken this stone and used it for something else. It was found in a staircase that they dug up. But it contains the only extra-biblical reference known so far to Pontius Pilate. It was a dedication stone for some public building that Pilate was dedicating in his role as prefect of Galilee, or of Israel, at the time of the Roman occupation, or at the time Jesus was killed or was crucified. It's the only, as I said, only known contemporary record that Pontius Pilate even existed. So we won't get into the rest of these in any detail. We'll wait until the next slide. But one thing I wanted to mention was, of course, here at Haifa, the harbor, it's at sea level. The Valley of Jezreel is about a little bit under 200 feet above sea level. And then the elevation drops down very quickly past Mount Tabor and through this slot right here that ends right here. That right here is a mountain called Carmel, and so at the bottom, that's 600 feet below sea level. So this moist air from the Mediterranean flows down through this slot and dumps out on the Sea of Galilee into this little bowl right here, and it swirls around. So you can see that that can lead to some pretty severe weather. Even though the lake is pretty small, it's only about 7 miles from on its width here, and I think it's only about 13 miles from north to south. So you can see, even though the lake is small, it can have some pretty severe storms. So let's look at the northern Sea of Galilee. As I said, it sits at about 600 feet below sea level. The Jordan flows into it up here from the north, and between the Jordan between the Sea of Galilee and Jericho, the elevation drops down to 900 feet below sea level, and then between Jericho and the Dead Sea, it drops another 400 feet or so down to the Dead Sea at minus 1,300. So, starting from the left or the west here, this city, Tiberias, was where, after the sacking of the temple, or the destruction of the temple in 70 AD by the Romans, the city of Tiberias became the center of Jewish learning, and it remained the center of Jewish learning and scholarship for the next 1,000 years or so. North of the city of, north of Tiberias, is this mountain Arbel, and it sits about 1,200 feet above the surface of the sea, so you can get a very, very good view of the surface of the sea from there. Down right here to the north of Arbel is where that slot that I just talked about emptied out. So the wind comes from up here in the Valley of Jezreel and past Mount Tabor, and then drops down quite a bit into the Sea of Galilee and causes the storms that are there. Now, across that slot from Mount Arbel is the village of Migdal, which in biblical times was called Magdala or Magadan, depending on where you're looking. That's where Mary Magdalene was from. And then just north of Migdal or Magdala is this city called Ginosar. It's a kibbutz city. And in the Bible, that was known as Gennesaret. It was a flat plain area, and that is where Jesus and his disciples landed as they were returning from the feeding of the 5,000. And you'll remember that was the story where Jesus walked on the water to join them. He had gone to be alone with his Father, and then the disciples got into a boat and started heading back toward the other side, from down in the south up to the northwest, and then he joined them walking on the water. In Ginosar, some fishermen from Ginosar in the 80s, I believe it was, discovered in the mud along the seashore a fairly well preserved fishing boat, very similar to what Peter and John and James and Philip would have used for fishing, and what they used to get back and forth on several occasions. Anyway, they found this fishing boat, and it's now preserved in a museum in very near the kibbutz, kibbutz Gennesaret. A little bit further along the coast to the north is Capernaum. That's the city where Jesus did most of his. It was his headquarters for the Galilean part of his ministry. That's where Peter was from, and the sons of thunder, sons of Zebedee, James and John, were from there. And it's just to the west of where the Jordan flows in from the north, from a place called Caesarea Philippi, flows into the Sea of Galilee. Now, somewhere on the other side of the river from Capernaum, nobody really knows where, but somewhere along the coast on the other side was Bethsaida, where Philip was from. Now, just as an aside here, no one really knows where the Sermon on the Mount was preached, but it was somewhere up above Capernaum. And the church, the Catholic Church, has built this Church of the Beatitudes right here, and that's where they commemorate it. And it's one of the places that you'll visit if you go to visit Israel. But nobody really knows where that sermon was preached. Just before we leave this page, up to the north of Capernaum is this place called Chorazin, and you may remember that Jesus had pronounced woes on Chorazin, saying, woe to you, Chorazin, and woe to you, Capernaum and Magdala, because if the miracles that have been done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, those Phoenician cities that we looked at earlier, then they would have, turned and repented and believed in the gospel and everything. So anyway, let's just take a look here at this mountain of Marbel. Now this, Arbel, I mean. This photograph was taken from our tour boat that left out of Tiberias, and that morning there'd been a pretty strong storm just before we left, and you can see that the sea is very disturbed still, all these white caps on it. And so you can see that the wind that flows down this slot coming from the Valley of Jezreel can really cause some trouble on the Sea of Galilee. The top of Mount Arbel sits about something like 500 feet above sea level, which the sea level here, or the lake, the surface of the lake, is 600 feet below sea level. So this is a pretty impressive height. It's about 1,200 feet above the surface of the lake. So if you go to the top of Mount Marbel, or Arbel, this is the view that you would get toward the north from Arbel. You can see, get an idea of how tall this is from this radio tower here. That's a several hundred feet tall radio tower, and in between the village of Magdala, or Magadan, in between that and Mount Arbel is this valley or slot that the wind blows down. So you can see it's kind of a funnel for the winds coming in from the Mediterranean. Now, by the way, these right here, these areas right here, those are sunshades for fruit crops. The Israelis grow bananas under these sunshades, and they grow wine grapes, and they grow olives, and they do grow grain, but they don't do a lot of row crops. They do mostly orchards and fruit. So across the road here from Magdala is this plain that we were talking about, the plain of Gennesaret, where Jesus and his disciples landed after the feeding of the 5,000. Then to the north, along the coastline of the lake, right here is the village of Capernaum. And you can see this area right here, you can see the lighter, how the water is lighter. That's the Jordan's inflow. The Jordan's inflow is right here. And the Jordan brings with it a bunch of sediments from the north of Galilee. There's a swampy area up here. There was a lake there in Jesus' time, very shallow lake, not more than a few feet deep. But it was deemed to be a breeding ground for malaria, the mosquitoes that carry malaria. And so the Israelis drained that lake in the 1950s. But the Jordan brings in nutrients in these sediments that it washes down from the north of Galilee down into the lake right here. And this is why those sediments are why those nutrients are why the fishing was so good. And that's why the cities of Capernaum and Bethsaida were fishing villages, if you will. And of course, they were all fishing villages along here, as evidenced by that boat that they found, which I'm not sure where that museum is. This may be it right here. So anyway, before we leave this slide, up here in the north is Mount Hermon, and you can see the snow is still on it. This photograph was taken toward late February, so the snow is still on the mountain. Believe it or not, there's a ski resort in Israel that's up on Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is one of the other possible sites for the Mount of Transfiguration. Mount Hermon also forms the border between Israel on the south, Lebanon on the west, and Syria on the east. So just continuing on here, the Bible mentions the Decapolis, and we need to take just a brief look at what that means. Now, the word Decapolis is used in two ways. It's used to refer to a general area or region, you can see, called Decapolis here. And by the way, this slide talks about or shows the travels of Jesus. I'm not quite sure about some of these routes, so I would take some of these with a grain of salt. For example, it says right here that Jesus traveled to and from Jerusalem this way. Well, yes, he did. At least one time he traveled to Samaria to speak to the Samaritan woman at the well, at Jacob's well, that's in John 4. But usually, most people that traveled from Galilee to Jerusalem for the feasts went up the Jordan, down the Jordan, down to Jericho, which isn't shown here, and then up to Jerusalem. It was a climb from about 900 feet below sea level to about just a little under 3,000 feet at Jerusalem above sea level. So it was quite a climb in the space of about 15 miles or so. And that's why they would sing these Psalms of Ascents, if you remember. I can't remember which Psalms they are. But anyway, they're called the Psalms of Ascents. Now, so this region of Decapolis, the word Decapolis really just means 10 cities. And these are the 10 cities. Most of them were in this region down here in the southeast and east of the Sea of Galilee. But some of them were, outliers. Scythopolis, this is the Greek name for Bet-Shan, which is down here. That was, remember the Philistines had nailed the bodies of Saul and his sons to the wall in Bet-Shan, or what was known in Jesus' time as Scythopolis. And then the other main outlier, is Damascus, the capital of Syria. It's the longest continuous or oldest continuous continuously occupied city in the world. It was one of the Decapolis, but it was some 50 miles north of this region here where the rest of the cities were. Just another couple of things to look at on this, and then we'll call this little diatribe to a close. Here at Caesarea Philippi, that's the source of the Jordan River. And in the Bible, Caesarea Philippi was famous for one of my favorite stories in the entire Word of God. Jesus had gone to Caesarea Philippi, and he asked the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" Well, he said, "Who do men say that I am?" So they said, "Well, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah or one of the prophets." And he said, "Well, okay, but who do you say that I am?" And Peter said, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And that's why it says here on this, Peter's great confession was made at Caesarea Philippi. It's now called Banias. In Roman times, it was called Caesarea Philippi, and then later on it was named Panias. But in Arabic, they don't have a sound for P, so it's been changed to Banias on modern maps. Anyway, before we leave these maps, two things. Gadara, one of the Decapolis, was where Jesus went. He sailed from Capernaum down to somewhere around here and went to the land of the Gadarenes. And in the land of the Gadarenes, he ministered to this young man who had been possessed by a legion of demons. And he cast those demons into a herd of swine, and then they promptly ran into the lake. So where exactly that happened, we don't know. But the land of the Gadarenes was in this area here. So another couple things here: Tyre and Sidon. The current Israel-Jordan border is somewhere around here, just south of Tyre. As I said, they were Phoenician seaports, very powerful cities in the time of the Phoenicians. They had, by the time of Jesus, they had been conquered by many people, but they still had Phoenician people living there. Notice that around Tyre is this region of Tyre, and then the region of Sidon. So we'll look at that in Matthew 15, where Jesus traveled to Tyre and Sidon to minister to this Syro-Phoenician woman. The other thing I wanted to point out was, remember, Jesus went through Samaria to talk to the woman at the well, and she said, "Well, we worship the Lord on this mountain." Well, that mountain that she was talking about was Mount Gilboa right here. And she said, "Well, yeah, but you Jews say we have to worship in Jerusalem." And then Jesus responded to her that there's coming a time, and the time is actually now, that we'll worship God in spirit and in truth, because God is seeking such to worship Him. And with that, I think that's about all we have to say. By the way, some of these, for example, this map shows Bethsaida located right here. Well, as I said, nobody really knows where Bethsaida was. It had to have been on the seacoast, and it had to have been, or on the lake coast, or the Sea of Galilee on the shore, and it had to have been opposite the Jordan inflow from Capernaum. So somewhere around here, but where it definitely was, nobody really knows. And this right here, as I said, at the time of Jesus, Lake Hule was there, very shallow lake, but it's been since drained. So in modern times, you won't see this on the map because it's still very swampy lowland, but doesn't have a lake on it. And I think that's about it. So thank you for listening, and let's continue in our study of Matthew.